You're probably familiar with this basic model of human memory. The important terms are working memory, long-term memory, and the relationship between the two. Our long-term memory seems to have infinite capability, but we don't leave long enough to actually fully test that out. But for information to get in there and to become established in long-term memory, it has to be processed in working memory, which we know has a limited capability. In the literature, the typical number is 7 plus or minus 2 bits, though some cognitive scientists say it's actually less. However, an important consideration from a teaching learning point of view is how do we effectively get information from working memory into long-term memory? Well, we pretty much know that if the information is well organised, it's chunked up to fit the capacity of working memory, it's meaningful to learners, and is sufficiently rehearsed, that is repeated, so that it becomes encoded neurologically in long-term memory, that certainly helps. So let's explore some of these terms and look at the pedagogic implications. Working memory, yeah, it's got a limited capability. However, the problem is this, that information has to go through working memory. Given the limited capability, and given that we seem to be subject to more and more and more information explosion, there's a real problem because the active processing of that information has to go on in working memory, and that's not going to change unless there's some kind of radical evolution. So, this is a big problem, managing cognitive load. I actually think it's possibly the only really significantly new 21st century skill, because at the end of the day, it's all right having the Internet of Things and all this information, but it's still got to go through working memory. Now, here's a big point that for a long time, long-term memory was seen as a big kind of dumping ground. The stuff gets put in there and it may or may not stay, and stuff eventually gets forgotten. But recent cognitive science is showing that it's the long-term memory, our long-term memory systems that are the central dominant structure. Because essentially, once the information's in there, once it's all in, this is what enables us to solve problems based on our prior knowledge encoded in long-term memory systems. So, this is the big point, that if you look at what separates experts from novices, it's that when experts come across a new problem, if they've seen that problem before, and if they've solved it before, and they understand how it works, and it's in their long-term memory system, it's pretty easy. Whereas for novices, even though they might have some information and quite a lot in the field, they may have to go through a long process of thinking, finding out information, and doing tests to come to the same conclusions. So, here's a lovely analogy for you, the Maserati analogy. I made this one up because to some extent, our memory system is a little bit like a Maserati. Our Maseratis go pretty fast. Our long-term memory has massive capability, but unfortunately, we have to process information in working memory. So it's a kind of like a Maserati, but most of the time we're working in first gear at best. However, this is the real significant point, that as we build up strong long-term memory structures, as we become experts in the field, and that information is nicely organised in our long-term memory systems, and that when we're confronted with a problem in that field, all of a sudden the working memory opens up, and all of that knowledge is accessible to working memory that exists in long-term memory. So for that period of time, in our subject specialism, we are driving the Maserati in fourth gear. And that's why it's not so bad as we get older if we keep learning, because we might lose a little bit of dexterity and our working memory might not be as sharp. If it's all nicely encoded in a long-term memory, we have an advantage over younger people. And I like that idea. Okay, let's have a look at some of the pedagogic implications of our memory systems. Well, you're probably familiar with some of these. It certainly helps learning if we chunk stuff up to reduce cognitive overload. And if we can make that content more engaging, get the thinking process going, that will help make learning more meaningful, and that will help the memory process. And we must build in time for rehearsal and review of the content. So those key concepts, principles, need to be rehearsed a number of times to get them transferred into long-term memory. So, effective transfer from working memory to long-term memory. It's a bit of a Russian doll pedagogically. So, if we can really work on accommodating the working of memory systems to the way we design our learning experiences, the way we teach, it has massive benefits. Here's a few more. That if we get students thinking in our lessons and we can chunk the bits together and encourage them to make explicit their thinking and our thinking, making thinking visible, it's all useful for the processing of information. And memory is strengthened by repetition and testing rather than total time spent. So recall and review is critical, and we can see what that looks like in this graph here. That without recall, you can see that within a week, over 50% of the information is lost. But with 3 or 4 good reviews, that information starts to become stable in long-term memory. And that's why we often have an experience of teachers that we teach 1 week and 3 or 4 weeks later, it's like the students never went through the lesson. And that's because most of it's been lost, because it hasn't been sufficiently rehearsed and reviewed. Okay, moving on. If we look at graphic organisers and various other types of visual representation, we can see that they have big effect sizes on student learning if they're actually done well, because diagrams contain all the details. So the learner is forced to look at the key points. It helps to see the wood from the tree. Also, given that our sensory system is largely visually orientated, that recall is almost always visually triggered. So visual representation, cue, and memory processing. And only structured information will go into long-term memory. So that will help the transmission from working memory to long-term memory and, of course, subsequent recall. Now, you may have heard of the partner strategy, which we'll look at in the next slide. That certainly helps us. So there we go. This is the basic model. It can be depicted as follows, that we start when we teach, we show the whole picture. It's like providing the outline of a jigsaw puzzle. Then we start to introduce the parts, but the parts in ways that do not create cognitive overload. And each part may have some various segments of content. So we work with the old first, we take apart the segments in the part, and then eventually we go back to the old again. So the process looks something like this. The first old creates that organizational framework. Then the parts are developed with their own segments, and eventually we go back to looking at the old again. And this goes on as an iterative process, and it builds understanding. So that's the way that actually works. And finally, let's just go back to our model of human memory. And as you can see, this is a slightly fuller model. The basic principles are the same, but what we now know is that working memory and long-term memory have a dynamic integrating relationship. That, yeah, working memory does the conscious processing, but long-term memory will, at a subconscious and unconscious level, be processing and organising information as well. So long-term memory is an active system. So the dynamics of our memory system as a totality are massively important in terms of the learning process. And quite simply, in terms of a Russian doll principle, the way we work with memory systems to help students to learn, how these are managed affects the rate and quality of learning. It's a big area for any teaching professional to be very familiar with and apply that in the way they design learning experiences, in the way